757. That is the number the Pentagon quietly updated in a database this week, and it represents something the United States government has spent months not fully explaining. 757 American service members wounded, 18 dead, not from a single battle, not from one headline-grabbing strike, but from 6 months of a war that officially paused twice and never actually ended. Most Americans could not tell you the name of the operation their sons and daughters are fighting in. Fewer still could tell you how those hundreds of injuries happened, because the Pentagon itself has offered almost no details. What we do know is contained in a database most people have never heard of, updated in silence, revealing a war that has cost far more than the White House has said out loud. To understand why that number matters, you have to go back to a moment that, on the surface, looked like progress. In late February 2026, American and Iranian negotiators sat down in Geneva for what officials on both sides described as the most substantive nuclear talks in years. There was cautious optimism. Both parties agreed to keep talking. 2 days later, the bombs fell. In the early hours of February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated assault that the Pentagon named Operation Epic Fury and Israel called Operation Roaring Lion. Within the first 24 hours, American and Israeli forces struck more than 1,000 targets inside Iran. The opening salvo was designed to decapitate the regime, and it did. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed, along with the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Armed Forces Chief of Staff. It was the most direct assault on Iranian state power in decades, and it happened just hours after both governments had signaled they were still willing to talk. This was not a sudden collision between two countries. It was the culmination of a rivalry that had been escalating for years. And to understand February 28th, you first have to understand what came before it. The relationship between Washington and Tehran had been fraying since 2018, when the first Trump administration withdrew the United States from the 2015 nuclear agreement that had capped Iran's uranium enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. Without that deal, Iran's enrichment crept back upward year after year, edging closer to weapons-grade material. Then came October 2023, when the Hamas attack on Israel and the war that followed set off a chain reaction across the region. Israel systematically dismantled the network of allied militant groups Iran had spent decades building what analysts call the axis of resistance. Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, was killed in an Israeli strike in September 2024. Hamas's top leadership was eliminated in Gaza. The Assad government in Syria, Iran's most important state ally, collapsed in December 2024. By the time Donald Trump returned to office in January 2025, Iran's regional shield had already been badly weakened, even before a single American bomb had fallen on Iranian soil. Trump initially pursued negotiations, sending a letter to Khamenei in March 2025 proposing a new nuclear deal, and indirect talks began through Omani mediators. But in June 2025, those talks collapsed into open war. Israel struck first, hitting Iranian nuclear and military sites on June 13th. One day after the International Atomic Energy Agency formally found Iran in violation of its non-proliferation obligations for the first time in 2 decades. The United States entered on June 21st, striking 3 Iranian nuclear facilities directly. That war lasted 12 days before a ceasefire took hold. It became known simply as the 12-Day War, and it left Iran's military further degraded and its nuclear infrastructure damaged, though not destroyed. Inside Iran, the following months brought a wave of anti-government protests that spread across all 31 provinces, driven by a collapsing economy and rising anger at the regime, protests that Iranian security forces met with lethal force. By the time American and Iranian negotiators sat down again in Geneva in late February 2026, Iran was arguably weaker, more isolated, and more internally unstable than at any point in decades. That context matters because it shapes one of the central debates historians and policymakers are already having about this war. Whether the February 28th strikes were a response to an imminent nuclear threat, or whether Washington and Israel recognized a rare window with Iran's proxies shattered and its government facing internal unrest, and moved to finish what the 12-Day War had started. The White House framed the strikes as preemptive self-defense, aimed at permanently ending Iran's path to a nuclear weapon and dismantling its ballistic missile arsenal. Israeli officials described it as the removal of an existential threat. But the speed and scale of the opening attack raised an immediate question that would follow the war for months afterward. Was this a strike to stop an imminent threat, or a war aimed at regime change dressed in the language of self-defense? The State Department has maintained that the campaign falls within the recognized bounds of international law and collective self-defense. Critics, including international law scholars, have argued the operation crossed a different line entirely, launched while diplomacy was still technically alive. That argument has never been resolved, and it shapes how history may eventually judge everything that followed. adding weight to that debate. One policy research organization has reported that a strike during the opening days of the campaign hit a girls' primary school in the town of Manab, reportedly killing close to 100 children between the ages of 7 and 12. That claim has not been independently verified by a U.S. government source, and the Pentagon has not confirmed or addressed it directly. But it illustrates how contested the human toll of this war is, even before you get to the American casualty figures, and how much of the full picture, on both sides, remains outside what either government has been willing to confirm. Iran did not stay quiet for long. Within hours, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones, not only at Israel, but at American bases and allied nations scattered across the Gulf. Iran's military doctrine, built over years around what analysts call a mosaic defense system, allowed it to keep striking even after its top commanders had been killed. Command was decentralized by design, precisely so that decapitating the leadership would not immediately end Iran's ability to fight back. Within the first week, American forces alone had engaged roughly 3,000 targets. By day 10, that number had climbed past 5,000. This was not a limited strike package. It was rapidly becoming one of the largest military campaigns the Middle East had seen since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Then Iran reached for a weapon that had nothing to do with missiles. On the day the war began, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared the Strait of Hormuz closed to American and Israeli-linked shipping. This narrow waterway between Iran and Oman carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas trade. Closing it, or even threatening to, is one of the few moves Iran has that can inflict pain on the global economy without a single missile crossing into American territory. Oil prices spiked. Fuel shortages rippled through parts of Asia. Shipping insurers began pricing in war risk for one of the planet's most critical choke points. What started as a strike on Iranian soil had, within days, become a crisis affecting fuel prices on the other side of the world. The fighting was not confined to missiles and airstrikes either. In the hours before the first bombs fell, American and Israeli operators reportedly moved to disrupt Iranian command, control, and sensor networks through cyber operations, laying groundwork for the physical strikes that followed. Israel also ran information operations inside Iran itself, including the compromise of a widely used Iranian prayer app and elements of state broadcasting, part of an effort to sow confusion and undercut the regime's ability to control the domestic narrative. Iran and allied hacktivist groups threatened retaliation in kind, though widespread internet blackouts imposed inside Iran during the war, likely intended to control information flow to the population, appear to have limited how effective any Iranian cyber counterattack could actually be. It was a reminder that a modern war between a nuclear-capable American ally and a nuclear-aspiring adversary is fought simultaneously on a battlefield most civilians will never see. For the first 10 days of the war, the Pentagon disclosed almost nothing about American casualties. Officials confirmed 8 service members seriously wounded and left it there. Then, on March 10th, Reuters reported, citing sources familiar with internal figures, that the real number of wounded troops was closer to 150. The Pentagon responded within hours, revising its own public estimate upward to roughly 140, while insisting most of the injuries were minor and that the majority of those wounded had already returned to duty. It was a telling sequence. The public did not learn the scale of American casualties from a press briefing. It learned from investigative reporting that forced the Pentagon's hand. That pattern of official figures trailing behind what journalists and independent trackers were uncovering would repeat itself again and again as the war dragged on. By early April, after more than 5 weeks of continuous strikes and counterstrikes, the fighting had become unsustainable for both sides to continue at that pace. On April 7th and 8th, the United States and Iran, with Israel included, agreed to a ceasefire, reportedly after intervention from Pakistani officials who urged Washington to hold off a planned new wave of strikes. For the first time in over a month, a single day passed without American attacks on Iran and without Iranian strikes on American assets. It looked, briefly, like the war might be winding down. But the ceasefire's foundation was narrow and fragile. It hinged almost entirely on one unresolved question: who controls the Strait of Hormuz? That question defined the next 2 months. Iran refused to fully reopen the strait, insisting on routing ships through corridors it approved and, according to multiple reports, seeking to eventually collect fees on vessels passing through waters it does not exclusively own. The United States viewed this as a violation of the spirit of the ceasefire and periodically resumed strikes on Iranian naval assets and drone launch sites near the strait beginning in mid-March, even while the broader ceasefire technically held elsewhere. By June, mediators had brokered something more formal, a memorandum of understanding announced on June 14th, intended to end the conflict within 60 days. It required the United States to lift its naval blockade of Iranian ports and required Iran to guarantee safe passage for commercial shipping. For a moment, there was a real off-ramp on the table. It did not hold. In early July, shipping traffic through the strait actually increased, peaking at 49 vessels crossing on July 7th, a sign the fragile arrangement might be working. Then, on July 6th and 7th, Iran struck 3 commercial vessels that had bypassed its pre-approved shipping route. The Trump administration treated this as a clear breach of the memorandum. President Trump declared the ceasefire over. The United States resumed strikes, this time targeting infrastructure far from the coast, including a cruise missile strike on a bridge roughly 900 miles from the strait itself and a projectile that struck near Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant. Iran responded by formally re-announcing the closure of Hormuz and launching retaliatory strikes that reached Jordan, threatened Bahrain and Qatar, and, according to the UAE, damaged 2 commercial tankers in Omani waters, killing 1 crew member. What had briefly looked like a war winding down was, by the second week of July, a war reigniting on a widened front, now touching Jordan, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE, all countries that had not been direct combatants when the first bombs fell in February. It is this second phase of the war, beginning July 7th, that produced the most revealing and least explained numbers of the entire conflict. In late July, the Pentagon quietly created a new classification inside its casualty database called Overseas Operations, separate from the official Operation Epic Fury category, which the Pentagon says formally concluded on May 5th. Officials have offered no public explanation of exactly what overseas operations covers, no breakdown of which strikes or incidents produced which injuries, and no clarification of why casualties tied to ongoing combat against the same enemy in the same region needed a new and vaguer label. What the department has confirmed is the scale. As of May 5th, when Operation Epic Fury was declared concluded, 418 American service members had been wounded and 14 had been killed. Since July 7th, under the new Overseas Operations heading, at least 339 more troops have been wounded and 4 more have died. Combined, the total stands at 757 wounded and 18 killed, according to the Defense Department's own casualty analysis system, updated as recently as this week. The database itself tells its own quiet story. The Defense Casualty Analysis System is not designed for public storytelling. It is a bureaucratic ledger, updated periodically, with entries that rarely make front pages on their own. On August 19th, the Pentagon updated it once again, adding more than 50 newly recorded wounded personnel in a single revision, even as talks between Washington and Tehran remained stalled. That single update, quietly logged, was larger than the entire American casualty count the Pentagon had originally acknowledged in the war's first 10 days. It is a measure of how far the conflict has expanded, and of how much the public's understanding of its cost still lags behind the reality being recorded in real time inside a government database. Behind that combined figure is a breakdown that says something about who is actually absorbing the risk. Of the 757 wounded, more than 580 are Army soldiers, the largest single share by far. 86 are sailors, 64 are airmen, 19 are Marines. That distribution points toward ground-based and shore-based personnel, likely stationed at the network of American bases scattered across the Gulf that have absorbed the brunt of Iranian missile and drone retaliation, rather than casualties from a single dramatic battle. And still, the Pentagon and United States Central Command have released almost no details about how any individual injury occurred, what specific attacks caused the heaviest tolls, or how much damage American installations across the region have actually sustained. For a war that has now wounded more Americans than several recent, far more publicly scrutinized conflicts combined, the silence surrounding the mechanics of those injuries is itself part of the story. The financial cost has been easier to trace, and it is staggering in its own right. Independent trackers using Pentagon disclosures, Congressional Budget Office methodology, and estimates from defense research groups have pegged the direct cost of the military campaign at roughly $37.5 billion through mid-August. The first 6 days of the war alone were the most expensive stretch, with interceptor missiles and standoff munitions burning through an estimated $1.9 billion a day, according to analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The Trump administration has since requested a defense budget of $1.5 trillion from Congress, which includes a specific line of roughly $70 billion earmarked to fund continued operations and naval blockades in the Middle East. That request landed in the same week the United States' total national debt crossed a record $40 trillion. A milestone reached just 5 months after the debt passed $39 trillion in March. Itself only 5 months after it crossed $38 trillion the previous October. The war is not the sole driver of that trajectory, but it is unfolding inside a federal budget, already straining under defense spending, entitlement programs, and mounting interest payments, and every additional billion requested for the Gulf campaign adds directly to that pressure. As the human and financial costs mounted through the summer, the diplomatic picture grew murkier rather than clearer. CNN reported, citing U.S. officials briefing American allies, that Washington has begun shifting its approach away from further large-scale military escalation and toward what officials described as a strategy of gradually economically strangling Iran instead. The clearest evidence of that strategy arrived this week. On August 19th, the United Arab Emirates announced it was suspending all trade and financial transactions with Iran, a decision it linked directly to renewed Iranian ballistic missile fire that triggered nationwide shelter warnings across the UAE for the first time in weeks. The move matters because sanctions from Washington alone have never been able to fully sever this particular economic relationship. The UAE supplied roughly 31% of Iran's imports in 2024, an estimated $21 billion worth of trade, and received 13% of Iran's exports. Losing that lifeline, on top of existing American and European sanctions and a continuing naval blockade of Iranian ports, represents one of the most significant tightenings of the noose around Iran's economy since the war began, achieved not through another airstrike but through the collapse of a regional trading relationship under the weight of Iran's own continued attacks on shipping. Iran, for its part, has said the blockade and the broader pressure campaign are already producing shortages and price increases inside the country, while insisting it will not reopen the strait until the United States meets its own obligations under the June memorandum, including lifting the port blockade, removing oil sanctions, and unfreezing Iranian assets held abroad. As of this week, President Trump has said no talks are currently underway or scheduled with Tehran. Analysts at Deutsche Bank noted that combination silence from the White House on renewed negotiations paired with continued Iranian intransigence over the strait has pushed oil futures for deliveries a year from now to a 2-month high, a sign that markets do not expect a resolution anytime soon. What remains unresolved, and may remain unresolved for a long time, is the full human accounting of this war. The Pentagon has confirmed the total number of dead and wounded, but has declined to detail the incidents behind them. Independent trackers monitoring the Strait of Hormuz separately have documented at least 17 merchant ships damaged since the crisis began, several abandoned, 2 captured, and a dozen seafarers killed or missing, casualties that sit entirely outside the military's own count of American service members and reflect a war that has quietly drawn in commercial shipping crews from multiple nations. Legal scholars continue to debate whether the opening decapitation strike, launched while diplomatic talks were technically still alive, was a legitimate act of preemptive self-defense or something that violated the basic framework of international law the United States has spent decades helping to build. Neither question has an official answer, and neither is likely to get one soon, given that the war itself has not formally ended, only shifted in character from open combat to blockade, sanctions, and intermittent strikes whenever Iran tests the edges of the maritime restrictions still in place. There is also the question of what winning even means here. The stated objective in February was to permanently end Iran's path to a nuclear weapon. 6 months and $37.5 billion later, independent assessments suggest Iran's nuclear infrastructure has been damaged, in some cases severely but not eliminated, echoing the same unresolved outcome left behind by the 12-day war the previous summer. Iran's government, battered by 2 rounds of American and Israeli strikes and a wave of domestic unrest, remains in power. Its regional network of allied militias, already diminished before this war began, has been weakened further. But the core of the standoff, Iran's nuclear ambitions and its willingness to use the Strait of Hormuz as leverage, remains exactly where it was in February, just far more expensive and far bloodier than either side likely anticipated. What has changed most concretely is the human ledger, both nations' willingness to absorb continued losses and the shape of the pressure now being applied. Less through bombing runs and more through the kind of economic strangulation the UAE's decision this week represents. What is not in dispute is the number that started this story. 757 Americans wounded, most of them soldiers, absorbed largely by an American public that has had almost no visibility into how, where, or why those injuries happened. 18 families who received the news no family wants to receive, spread across a war fought under 2 different operational names as if the fighting itself needed rebranding once it dragged on longer than anyone in Washington had planned for. A war that began with the promise of a decisive strike against a single regime's leadership has become something else entirely. A slow-burning contest over a 61-kilometer stretch of water, fought now as much through trade suspensions and blockades as through missiles, with no clear finish line and a casualty count. The Pentagon updates quietly, a few dozen names at a time in a database most Americans will never open. 6 months in, the war that was supposed to end quickly with a single decisive blow has instead settled into something harder to see and harder to end. A contest of endurance, measured not in territory gained, but in ships turned away, assets frozen, and a number in a government spreadsheet that keeps climbing.